The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the emergency room, casting harsh shadows across the sterile white walls. Dr. Marcus Rivera moved with practiced efficiency between patients, his hands steady despite the exhaustion that had settled deep in his bones after 18 hours on shift. The familiar chaos of the ER had become his sanctuary, a place where his military training translated seamlessly into saving civilian lives. Marcus had been back stateside for 3 years now, but the transition from Navy SEAL medic to emergency room physician hadn't erased the hypervigilance that kept his shoulders perpetually tense. He noticed everything: the way patients held their bodies, the subtle signs of trauma that others might miss, the tells that separated those seeking drugs from those genuinely in pain. The automatic doors whooshed open, bringing with them the controlled urgency of the ambulance crew. 28-year-old female, motorcycle versus sedan. The paramedic called out, his voice cutting through the ambient noise. Multiple contusions, possible concussion, vitals stable, but she's been unresponsive to questioning. Marcus looked up from the chart he'd been reviewing, his dark eyes immediately focusing on the figure strapped to the gurney. The woman appeared unconscious, her face partially obscured by an oxygen mask, long dark hair matted with blood from a scalp laceration. Her leather jacket had been cut away, revealing a black tank top beneath, and her jeans were torn at the knee where road rash painted angry red streaks across pale skin. "Bay 3, Marcus directed, falling into step beside the gurney. As they moved, he began his assessment, checking pupils, pulse, breathing. Standard protocol. But something made him pause as they transferred her to the hospital bed. The woman's eyes fluttered open for a moment, unfocused and glassy, but in that brief instant before they closed again, Marcus caught something that made his breath hitch. There was a depth there, a hardness that spoke of experiences far beyond a simple traffic accident. It was a look he recognized because he'd seen it in his own mirror every morning for the past 3 years. "What's her name?" he asked the paramedic while beginning to examine the patient more thoroughly. "No ID found at the scene. John Doe or Jane Doe, I guess. Bike was registered to someone else, probably borrowed or stolen." The paramedic shrugged, already preparing to leave for their next call. Marcus nodded, but his attention was focused on his patient. As he carefully examined her injuries, cataloging each bruise and abrasion, his trained eye began to notice inconsistencies. The calluses on her hands weren't from office work or casual motorcycle riding. They were thick, purposeful, the kind that came from weapons training and rope work. Her muscle tone, visible despite her current condition, spoke of serious physical conditioning that went beyond weekend gym sessions. But it was when he pushed up her sleeve to insert in 4 that Marcus felt the world shift beneath his feet. There, etched into the skin of her inner forearm in precise black ink, was a tattoo that made his hand still completely. It was small, easily missed if you weren't looking for it, but unmistakable once seen. A trident and eagle, the insignia of naval special warfare, but modified in a way that made his blood run cold. The design incorporated elements he'd only seen once before in classified briefings about units that officially didn't exist. The kind of operations that left no paper trail, no official recognition, no parade when you came home. His own experiences in special operations had taught him to recognize the signs of deep cover work, but this was something else entirely. Marcus stepped back from the bed, his heart pounding as memories flooded back, unbidden. 3 years ago, in a dusty compound outside Kandahar, his unit had been called in for emergency medical support during what was supposed to be a routine intelligence gathering operation. What they'd found instead was carnage, and a single American operative, female, who'd fought her way out of an ambush that should have killed everyone involved. He'd never seen her face clearly that night. She'd been covered in blood, both her own and that of the enemies she'd eliminated, her features obscured by dirt and tactical gear. But he remembered her voice, steady and professional as she'd briefed them on the situation while he'd worked to stabilize her wounded teammate. He remembered the way she'd moved despite her injuries, the quiet authority in her bearing that had impressed even his battle-hardened unit commander. Most of all, he remembered the tattoo he'd glimpsed when he'd treated a knife wound on her arm. The same design, now lying unconscious before him. The rational part of his mind tried to dismiss it as coincidence. Tattoos could be copied, designs shared. But every instinct honed by years of combat experience was screaming that this was the same woman. The woman whose operation had been so classified that they'd been ordered never to speak of it, never to include it in any official reports. The woman who disappeared into the night after her team was evacuated, leaving Marcus to wonder if she'd even survive her injuries. "Doctor," the nurse's voice cut through his memories. "Her vitals are spiking. Should we be concerned about internal bleeding?" Marcus forced himself back to the present, but his hands trembled slightly as he resumed his examination. He was a professional, he reminded himself. Whatever history this woman might have, right now she was simply his patient, and she needed medical care. But as he worked, checking for signs of serious internal injury, he couldn't shake the feeling that fate had brought her into his ER for reasons beyond a simple traffic accident. The coincidences were too numerous, too specific. The tattoo, the physical conditioning, the way she held herself even in unconsciousness. It all pointed to a conclusion that seemed impossible yet undeniable. The preliminary CT scan results came back clean. No brain bleeding, no obvious internal injuries. The woman's condition was serious, but not life-threatening, primarily consisting of a concussion, multiple contusions, and road rash that would require careful cleaning and bandaging. As Marcus began the process of cleaning her wounds, he found more evidence that supported his growing certainty about her identity. Scars. Old ones professionally treated, but unmistakable. A bullet wound on her shoulder, healed but still visible. Knife scars on her hands and arms. The kind of damage that came from a life lived in the shadows, fighting wars that never made the evening news. Each mark told a story of violence survived, of missions accomplished despite impossible odds. As he worked, the woman began to stir more frequently, her body fighting against the effects of the concussion. Her breathing changed, becoming more controlled, more deliberate. Marcus recognized the signs. She was waking up, and her training was kicking in even before full consciousness returned. "Easy," he said softly, his voice automatically taking on the calm, authoritative tone he'd learned to use with wounded operators. "You're safe. You're in a hospital." Her eyes snapped open immediately, clear and alert despite the head injury. They were green, he noticed, a pale green that seemed to see everything at once. Her gaze found his face and locked on, and Marcus felt that same recognition that had been haunting him reflected back in her stare. For a moment, neither of them moved. The busy ER continued around them, but in the space between the hospital bed and where Marcus stood, time seemed suspended. 3 years of wondering, of carrying the memory of that night in Afghanistan, suddenly crystallized into this single moment of mutual recognition. The woman's voice, when she finally spoke, was exactly as he remembered, low, controlled, with just a hint of the Texas accent she'd never quite lost despite years of training designed to strip away all identifying characteristics. "Doc." It was a question and a statement all at once. She remembered him too, despite the chaos of that night, despite the years that had passed. Marcus felt something inside his chest tighten, a mixture of relief and something else he couldn't quite name. "Yeah," he said simply. "It's me." The woman, and he realized he still didn't know her real name, had only known her by a code designation that night in Kandahar. Attempted to sit up, then immediately winced as the movement aggravated her injuries. "Stay down," Marcus instructed, his medical training overriding everything else. "You've got a concussion, and I haven't finished checking you over yet." She obeyed, but her eyes never left his face. "How bad?" "You'll live." "Motorcycle accident. You're lucky it wasn't worse." He continued his examination, but the clinical distance he usually maintained with patients was impossible now. "What happened to you?" "After that night, I mean. You just disappeared." A shadow crossed her features, and for the first time since waking up, she looked away from him. That's what we do. We disappear. The simple statement carried weight that Marcus understood all too well. In their world, successful operations meant that no one ever knew you were there. Heroes who couldn't be acknowledged, sacrifices that would never be honored publicly. It was the nature of the work, the price of operating in the gray spaces between official policy and necessary action. But something in her tone suggested that her disappearance had been more permanent than just the end of a mission. The way she'd said "we" in past tense, the careful distance in her voice, it painted a picture of someone who'd been cut loose from the only life she'd ever known. "Sarah," she said suddenly, and it took Marcus a moment to realize she was giving him her name. Not a code designation or operational alias, but her actual name. It felt like a gift, a sign of trust that he knew she didn't give lightly. "Marcus," he replied, though he suspected she already knew that much about him. The intelligence community was smaller than most people realized, especially at their level. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, there was something vulnerable there that hadn't been present before. "I heard about what happened to your unit. After Kandahar. I am sorry." The simple words hit Marcus harder than he'd expected. 3 months after their encounter with Sarah's operation, his SEAL team had been ambushed during what should have been a routine mission. Half his teammates had died in that dusty valley, victims of intelligence that had been compromised by someone they trusted. The official reports had been sanitized, the details classified, but the pain of losing his brothers had driven Marcus out of the military and into medicine, seeking a way to save lives instead of taking them. "How did you—" he began, then stopped. Of course she knew. In her world, information was currency, and the fate of operators who'd crossed paths with her mission would have been noted, filed away, remembered. "Intel travels fast in our community," she said quietly, "especially when good people die for bad reasons." There was something in her voice that suggested personal knowledge of betrayal, of operations gone wrong due to compromised intelligence. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as he began to wonder if their paths had crossed again, not by accident, but by design. "Sarah," he said carefully, "why are you here? Really here, I mean. This accident wasn't an accident," she finished for him, her voice so low that only he could hear it. At least, not entirely. Before Marcus could ask what she meant, the curtain around their bay was pushed aside, and Dr. Elizabeth Chun, the ER chief, stepped in. Her expression was professional, but curious as she looked between Marcus and his patient. "How's our Jane Doe doing?" she asked, though her eyes remained on Marcus, clearly picking up on the tension in the room. "Stable," Marcus replied automatically, forcing himself back into professional mode. "Concussion, multiple contusions, road rash. I like to keep her for observation overnight. Make sure there's no delayed complications from the head injury." Dr. Chin nodded, but Marcus could see her filing away the subtle changes in his demeanor for later inquiry. Elizabeth was a good doctor and a better friend, and she knew him well enough to recognize when something was affecting him beyond the normal stress of emergency medicine. "Good. Make sure to get her personal information for the records when she's feeling up to it." Elizabeth's gaze shifted to Sarah, who had closed her eyes and was doing an excellent job of appearing more injured than she actually was. "We'll also need to notify next of kin." "I'll take care of it," Marcus said quickly, perhaps too quickly based on the slight raise of Elizabeth's eyebrows. After Elizabeth left, promising to check back later, Marcus turned his attention back to Sarah. She had opened her eyes again and was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Thank you," she said simply. Marcus understood. In their world, contact with official authorities could be dangerous, could raise questions that couldn't be answered without compromising operations or revealing identities that needed to stay hidden. By offering to handle the paperwork himself, he was providing her cover, giving her time to figure out her next move. But he also had questions that couldn't wait. "Sarah, if this wasn't an accident, then someone tried to kill you. Are you safe here? Am I putting my hospital, my colleagues, at risk by treating you?" The directness of the question seemed to surprise her, but After a moment, she shook her head. No, at least, not from the people who caused the accident. They think I'm dead. The bike explosion would have been visible for miles, and they won't waste resources confirming what they believe they already know. The bike exploded. Marcus felt his blood run cold. A simple motorcycle accident was one thing, but an explosion suggested professional work, the kind of assassination attempt that left no survivors. I bailed before impact, saw the shooter on the overpass, realized what was going to happen. Took my chances with the asphalt rather than the alternative. Sarah's voice was matter-of-fact, but Marcus could see the pain in her eyes, and not just from her physical injuries. The casual way she described what must have been a terrifying life-or-death decision spoke to the kind of training and experience that few people possessed. But it also raised new questions about why someone wanted her dead badly enough to stage an elaborate assassination. As Marcus continued treating her injuries, cleaning, and bandaging the road rash that covered much of her left side, Sarah began to talk. Not about the specifics of what had led to someone trying to kill her, but about the time in between the 3 years since that night in Kandahar when their paths had first crossed. She'd been pulled out of active operations 6 months after their encounter, she explained. Officially, it was for medical reasons, too many injuries, too many close calls. Unofficially, there had been concerns about her psychological state, questions about whether she could still be trusted to make the hard choices that her position required. They were probably right to be worried, she admitted as Marcus applied antibiotic ointment to a particularly nasty abrasion. That night, when your unit pulled us out, something changed. I started questioning things I'd never questioned before. Marcus understood. He'd seen it in other operators, the moment when the moral certainty that allowed them to do impossible things began to crack. For some, it meant the end of their operational careers. For others, it meant becoming something different, something harder and colder than they'd been before. What did you do after they pulled you out? He asked, focusing on his work to keep his voice neutral. Contract work mostly. Private security, consulting. Try to stay in the game without being in the game, if that makes sense. Sarah winced as he cleaned a deeper cut near her collarbone. But the private sector, it's different. The lines aren't as clear. Sometimes the people paying your salary aren't the good guys, and you don't find out until it's too late. The implication hung in the air between them. Sarah had discovered something or done something that had put her on the wrong side of people powerful enough to arrange professional assassinations. The kind of people who had resources and reach that made hiding difficult, if not impossible. How long have they been hunting you? Marcus asked quietly. 6 months, give or take. Long enough that I've burned through most of my safe houses and emergency funds. Long enough that I was starting to think. She trailed off, but Marcus could fill in the rest. She'd been starting to think that running was pointless, that eventually they would find her and finish what they'd started. The admission made Marcus's chest tight with an emotion he couldn't quite identify. This woman, Sarah, had saved his life once, had made it possible for him to come home and build a new life after the military. The thought of her spending months running from shadows, slowly losing hope, was unacceptable in a way that surprised him with its intensity. So what's the plan now? He asked, stepping back to survey his handiwork. The worst of her injuries had been cleaned and bandaged, and while she would be sore for weeks, there was nothing that wouldn't heal with time and rest. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring up at the ceiling. When she finally spoke, her voice was tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. I don't know. For the first time in my adult life, I honestly don't know what comes next. My training, my experience, my contacts, none of it seems to matter when the people hunting you have more resources than you do and fewer moral constraints. Marcus felt something shift inside him, a decision forming before he'd consciously made it. Maybe it was gratitude for what she'd done for him and his team years ago. Maybe it was recognition of a fellow warrior who'd been abandoned by the system they'd served. Or maybe it was something simpler, the knowledge that sometimes the right choice wasn't the safe choice. You're staying here tonight for observation, he said finally. Medical necessity. Tomorrow, We'll figure out what comes after that. Sarah's eyes snapped to his face, searching for something. Marcus, you don't understand what you're offering. These people, they don't stop. They don't forgive. If they find out you helped me, then we'll make sure they don't find out. Marcus's voice carried a certainty he wasn't sure he felt, but he knew that backing down wasn't an option. You saved my life once. More than that, you saved my brother's lives. I'm not going to abandon you now. The vulnerability that had flickered across Sarah's features earlier returned, stronger now. For just a moment, she looked like what she was beneath all the training and scars and hard-won experience, a woman who had been alone for too long, carrying burdens too heavy for one person to bear. Why? She asked simply. Marcus considered the question, trying to find words for the complex mix of emotions and motivations that had led him to this decision. Debt and honor and something else, something that had to do with the way she'd looked at him across a battlefield 3 years ago, the recognition of a kindred spirit in the midst of chaos. Because everyone deserves a chance to come in from the cold, he said finally. And because I think we both know that some debts can only be paid forward. Sarah closed her eyes, and Marcus saw a single tear slip down her cheek before she quickly wiped it away. When she opened her eyes again, the vulnerability was gone, replaced by the controlled determination he remembered from that night in Afghanistan. Okay, she said quietly. We'll try it your way. As Marcus finished his documentation and prepared to hand Sarah's care over to the night shift nurse, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just set in motion events that would change both their lives in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The safe, predictable world he'd built for himself since leaving the military was about to be turned upside down. But as he looked at Sarah, already planning their next moves with the tactical mind that had kept her alive through years of impossible missions, Marcus realized he wasn't afraid of the change. If anything, for the first time in 3 years, he felt truly alive again. The night shift was about to begin, but Marcus knew that neither of them would be sleeping much. They had too much to discuss, too many plans to make, and too many ghosts from the past to face before they could even begin to think about the future. The hospital's rhythm changed as evening settled into night. The frenetic pace of the day's shift gave way to a different kind of urgency, punctuated by the steady beeping of monitors and the soft sounds of staff making their rounds. Marcus had officially ended his shift 2 hours ago, but he remained in the break room, nursing his third cup of coffee and watching the clock tick toward midnight. Sarah had been moved to a private room on the observation ward, officially under monitoring for her concussion. Marcus had pulled strings to ensure she was placed in room 314, which had the advantage of being at the end of the hallway with a clear view of both the elevator and the stairwell. Old habits from their shared past. Never be trapped with only one way out. He made his way through the quiet corridors, nodding to the night nurse who was updating charts at the central station. Maria Santos had worked nights at the hospital for 15 years, and Marcus trusted her discretion. When he'd explained that their Jane Doe was a friend who'd been in a bad accident and needed privacy while she recovered, Maria had simply nodded and made notes in the chart about limiting visitors. The door to room 314 was slightly ajar, and Marcus knocked softly before entering. Sarah was awake, sitting up in bed and staring out the window at the city lights below. She'd managed to clean herself up during the evening. Her hair was no longer matted with blood, and someone had found her a hospital gown that actually fit. But even cleaned up and medicated, she carried herself with the alert tension of someone who'd learned never to fully relax. "How are you feeling?" Marcus asked, settling into the visitor's chair beside her bed. "Like I got hit by a truck," Sarah replied with a slight smile, which, considering the alternative, isn't so bad. Marcus had spent the hours since their reunion researching everything he could find about motorcycle accidents and explosions, trying to piece together the technical aspects of what had happened to her. What he'd learned made her survival seem even more miraculous. "I've been thinking about the physics of what you described," he said. "Jumping from a motorcycle at highway speed, timing it to avoid an explosion, the margin for error would have been essentially zero." "I got lucky," Sarah said, "but There was something in her tone that suggested luck had very little to do with it. No, Marcus said quietly. You were that good. You've always been that good. The compliment seemed to make her uncomfortable. She shifted in the bed, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at her bandages. Being good at staying alive isn't the same as being good at living, Marcus. I'm starting to learn the difference. The statement hung between them, heavy with implications. Marcus had been wrestling with similar thoughts since leaving the military, struggling to translate skills honed for combat into something that could sustain a meaningful civilian life. The hypervigilance that had kept him alive in Afghanistan made it difficult to trust, to relax, to form the kind of connections that gave life meaning beyond mere survival. Tell me about the people hunting you, he said, changing the subject to more immediate concerns. What did you stumble into? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently tracing the edge of her hospital bracelet. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the careful neutrality of someone discussing classified information. 6 months ago, I was working private security for a consulting firm based in Dubai. High-end stuff, protecting executives, securing facilities, the kind of work that pays well and doesn't ask too many questions about your background. She paused, organizing her thoughts. The client was a tech company developing some kind of advanced encryption software. Military applications, defense contracts, the works. What kind of encryption? Marcus asked, though he suspected he knew where this was heading. Quantum-based. Something about using quantum entanglement to create unbreakable communication channels. I didn't understand the science, but I understood the implications. This wasn't just another security upgrade. This was technology that could revolutionize intelligence gathering and military communications. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Quantum encryption was the holy grail of secure communications, theoretically impossible to intercept or decode. In the wrong hands, it could render the intelligence capabilities of entire nations obsolete overnight. Let me guess, he said. Your client wasn't as legitimate as they appeared. The company was real enough, Sarah replied. But the people funding it, that's where things got complicated. It started small, meetings with investors who didn't quite fit the tech industry profile. Men in expensive suits who asked the wrong kinds of questions and seemed more interested in the military applications than the commercial potential. Arms dealers. Worse, state actors. I started recognizing faces from intelligence briefings, people who theoretically shouldn't have been in the same room together, let alone collaborating on cutting-edge technology theft. Sarah's voice hardened. They were planning to steal the encryption technology and sell it to the highest bidder. Or worse, give it directly to hostile foreign powers. Marcus could see how Sarah's moral compass, already strained by years of morally ambiguous operations, would have rebelled against such a clear-cut case of treason. The woman who had risked everything to save his team in Afghanistan would never have been able to stand by and watch American military secrets be handed over to enemies. What did you do? He asked, though he was already formulating the answer. What I was trained to do. I gathered evidence, documented the conspiracy, identified the key players. Sarah met his eyes, and then I discovered that some of the people involved had very high security clearances and very powerful friends. How high? High enough that when I tried to report what I'd learned through proper channels, I was told to forget what I'd seen and walk away. High enough that when I refused, people started dying. The simple statement carried weight that Marcus understood all too well. In the intelligence world, inconvenient witnesses had a tendency to suffer fatal accidents. Car crashes, heart attacks, overdoses, all easily explained, rarely investigated. The first to die was Dr. Chun Liu, the lead scientist on the encryption project. Official cause was a heart attack, but I'd been monitoring his health as part of my security assessment. He was 28 years old and in perfect condition. Then it was his research assistant, supposedly a suicide. Then the CFO of the company, who'd been asking questions about the funding sources. And you realized you were next on the list. I realized I was probably already supposed to be dead. The only reason I wasn't was that they needed time to cover their tracks, to make my death look as accidental as the others. Sarah's voice was matter-of-fact, but Marcus could see the strain in her eyes. 6 months of running, of waiting for the other shoe to drop, had taken its toll. Marcus leaned back in his chair, processing the implications of what she'd told him. A conspiracy involving foreign agents, corrupt officials, and stolen military technology. The kind of plot that should have been handled by federal agencies with resources and authority far beyond what 2 former operators could bring to bear. "You try going to the FBI?" he asked. "First thing I did when I realized how deep this went. But the conspiracy included people with access to federal databases, people who could monitor law enforcement communications. Every time I tried to make contact with clean agents, the information somehow got back to the wrong people. How do you know? Because they started using that information to set traps. Safe houses I'd mentioned in encrypted communications suddenly had surveillance teams watching them. Contact protocols I discussed with supposed federal agents got compromised within hours." Sarah shook her head. "Someone was feeding them everything I said, everything I planned." Marcus felt a familiar anger building in his chest, the same fury that had driven him to excel in special operations training. The idea that people entrusted with national security would betray that trust for money or ideology made his hands clench involuntarily. "So you've been running solo for 6 months?" he said. "No support, no backup, no one you could trust." "Until tonight," Sarah said quietly. "When I saw your face in that ER, I remembered what it felt like to not be completely alone." The admission hit Marcus harder than he'd expected. He'd been so focused on the tactical aspects of her situation that he'd overlooked the psychological toll of prolonged isolation. Sarah was one of the most competent operators he'd ever encountered. But even the strongest people had breaking points when faced with months of unrelenting pressure. "You're not alone anymore," he said, meaning it completely. "We'll figure this out together." "Marcus, you don't understand what you're up against. These people have killed at least 6 people that I know of, probably more. They have resources, connections, the ability to reach anywhere in the world. Getting involved with me puts you in the same crosshairs." "Maybe," Marcus acknowledged. "But I've been in crosshairs before. So have you. The difference is that this time we're not going in alone." Sarah studied his face for a long moment, searching for something. "Why are you doing this? Really? It can't just be about Afghanistan." Marcus considered the question, trying to find words for the complex mix of motivations that had led him to this moment. There was gratitude. Certainly, Sarah had saved his life and the lives of his teammates. There was professional respect, recognition of a fellow warrior who'd served with honor in impossible circumstances. But there was something else, something that had to do with the way she'd looked at him across that hospital bed, the recognition of shared experiences and shared burdens. Something that had to do with the fact that for the first time in 3 years, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. "I became a doctor to save lives," he said finally. "But saving lives isn't just about stopping bleeding and setting bones. Sometimes it's about giving someone a chance to build something better than what they're running from. And sometimes," Sarah replied softly, "it's about finding someone who understands what you've lost." The statement hung between them, acknowledging without directly stating the connection that had formed so quickly despite the years that had separated their lives. They were both refugees from a world that had used them up and cast them aside, both struggling to find meaning in civilian lives that felt hollow after the intensity of their military service. "So what's the plan?" Sarah asked, her voice taking on the crisp, professional tone he remembered from Afghanistan. "Assuming we can keep me hidden long enough to think strategically." Marcus had been considering that question since their conversation began. "First priority is intelligence. We need to know exactly who we're dealing with, what resources they have, how they're organized. You said you gathered evidence before you went underground. How much of it do you still have?" "Most of it. Documents, photographs, financial records, communication intercepts. I've got all stored in multiple encrypted locations, but accessing it means exposing our position to anyone monitoring those data streams." "Not necessarily. I got a friend who might be able to help with that. Someone with the technical skills to mask our digital footprint while we access your files. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Another former operator? Civilian. A hacker who does consulting work for law enforcement agencies. She's completely clean, no government connections that could be compromised, but she's got the skills to match anything the intelligence community can throw at us. You trust her? Marcus thought about Jenny Park, the brilliant Korean-American cybersecurity expert who'd helped him set up his personal digital security after he'd left the military. Jenny was abrasive, paranoid, and completely committed to privacy rights, exactly the kind of person they needed for this kind of operation. With my life, he said simply. More importantly, I trust her to hate the kind of surveillance state tactics your enemies are using. Give her a chance to stick it to corrupt government officials, and she'll work for free just for the satisfaction. Sarah smiled for the first time since waking up in the ER, and Marcus was struck by how the expression transformed her face. The hardness was still there, the wariness born of too many betrayals, but underneath it was a glimpse of the person she might have been in a different life. Okay, we contact your hacker friend, access my files, and start building a comprehensive picture of the conspiracy. What's the endgame? Exposure, Marcus said without hesitation. We can't fight this kind of power directly, but we can drag it into the light where it can't survive. Get the evidence to people who can act on it. Make enough noise that covering it up becomes more expensive than dealing with it honestly. That's assuming we can find clean channels to federal agencies. My experience suggests that might be harder than you think. Then we don't go to federal agencies. We go to journalists, foreign allies, congressional oversight committees. We make it impossible to ignore and too dangerous to suppress. Marcus leaned forward, feeling the familiar rush of planning a complex operation. They've been playing this game by intelligence community rules. Time to change the rules. Sarah nodded slowly, her tactical mind already working through the implications. It could work, but it's going to require perfect execution, and they'll throw everything they have at stopping us once they realize what we're doing. Good thing we're both used to operating under pressure. Marcus, Sarah said, her voice suddenly serious. If we do this, there's no going back. Your quiet life as an ER doctor, the safety you've built for yourself, all of that goes away the moment we start this fight. Are you sure that's what you want? Marcus considered the question, thinking about the life he'd constructed since leaving the military. It was safe, predictable, meaningful in its own way. He saved lives, made a difference, had built relationships with colleagues who respected his skills without knowing about his past. But it was also lonely, disconnected from the part of himself that had thrived under pressure, that had found purpose in facing impossible odds alongside people who understood the cost of that kind of life. Looking at Sarah, seeing the spark of tactical thinking returning to her eyes, Marcus realized that he'd been sleepwalking through the past 3 years. I'm sure, he said finally. The question is whether you're ready to stop running and start fighting back. Sarah was quiet for a moment, then reached over and gripped his hand with surprising strength. I've been ready for 6 months. I just needed someone I could trust to watch my back. You've got it, Marcus promised. Whatever comes next, we face it together. As if summoned by their planning, the soft chime of Sarah's 4 monitor indicated that her next round of medication was due. Marcus checked his watch. It was nearly 1 in the morning, and they both needed rest before they could begin the dangerous game they'd committed to playing. Get some sleep, he said, standing and adjusting her pillow. Tomorrow we start planning this thing properly. Marcus, Sarah called as he reached the door. Thank you. For everything. He turned back to find her watching him with an expression that was part gratitude, part determination, and part something else that made his chest tighten unexpectedly. Thank me when we're both still alive at the end of this, he said. As Marcus made his way back through the darkened hospital corridors, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just taken a turn that would define everything that came after. The safe world he'd built was about to be shattered, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he belonged. Tomorrow, They would begin the process of fighting back against enemies with virtually unlimited resources and reach. It would be dangerous, probably deadly, and almost certainly doomed to failure by any rational analysis. But as Marcus settled into the on-call room for a few hours of rest before his next shift, he found himself looking forward to the challenge with an anticipation he hadn't felt since his military days. Some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds, and some people were worth risking everything to protect. Sarah was both, and whatever came next, they would face it as partners in the truest sense of the word. 3 days later, Marcus stood in the parking garage beneath his apartment building, checking his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. The meeting with Jenny Park had been arranged through a series of encrypted messages that would have made paranoid conspiracy theorists proud, but in their current situation, extreme caution felt like basic survival instinct. Sarah emerged from behind a concrete pillar, moving with the fluid grace that marked her as a predator even in civilian clothes. The hospital had released her the previous morning with strict instructions to rest and avoid strenuous activity, instructions she'd clearly been ignoring based on the way she moved. Her injuries were healing faster than Marcus had expected, but he could still see the careful way she held her left shoulder where the road rash had been deepest. "Any sign of surveillance?" she asked, falling into step beside him as they walked toward the stairwell. "Clean. I've been monitoring the building for the past 24 hours. No unusual vehicles, no unfamiliar faces, no electronic signatures that shouldn't be there." Marcus pushed open the stairwell door, automatically checking the sight lines and escape routes. Old habits that had seemed paranoid just a week ago now felt prudent. They climbed to the 15th floor in silence, both of them listening for any sounds that might indicate they weren't alone. Marcus's apartment was spartanly furnished, the kind of space that belonged to someone who hadn't quite committed to putting down roots. But it had advantages for their current purposes: reinforced walls that would stop most surveillance equipment, multiple exit routes, and sight lines that allowed them to monitor approaches from several directions. Jenny Park was already there when they arrived, having let herself in through the sliding door to the balcony with a collection of electronic tools that would have impressed a professional burglar. She was a small woman in her early 30s, Korean-American with purple streak hair and the pale complexion of someone who spent most of their time in front of computer screens. Her appearance was deceptively casual: torn jeans, band t-shirt, canvas sneakers, but Marcus knew that the laptop bag slung over her shoulder contained enough computing power to break into most government databases. "You're late," she said without looking up from the collection of electronic equipment she'd spread across Marcus's dining table. "And you brought company without clearing it with me first." "Jenny, this is Sarah." "Sarah, Jenny." Marcus made the introductions while checking the locks and setting up the signal jamming equipment Jenny had requested. "Sarah's the one with the information I told you about." Jenny finally looked up, her dark eyes immediately cataloging Sarah's appearance with the same systematic attention she brought to computer code. Marcus could see the moment when Jenny's trained paranoia recognized the signs of someone with serious combat experience. The way Sarah held herself, the systematic way she'd position herself to watch both entrances to the apartment, the subtle calluses that spoke of weapons training. "Military?" Jenny asked bluntly. "Former," Sarah replied equally directly. "You?" "Stanford Computer Science, MIT graduate program, 3 years with the NSA before I decided I preferred working for the good guys." Jenny's tone carried the edge of someone who'd learned hard lessons about the difference between serving your country and serving the people who ran it. "Marcus says you've got evidence of a conspiracy involving stolen military technology and foreign agents." "That's the simplified version," Sarah said, settling into the chair across from Jenny. "The reality is more complicated and significantly more dangerous." Jenny's eyes lit up with the kind of anticipation that Marcus had learned to associate with her professional challenges. "Show me." Sarah pulled a small device from her jacket pocket, a heavily modified USB drive that looked like it had been reinforced against physical damage and electronic tampering. "Everything's on here." documents, photographs, financial records, communication intercepts, analysis notes. 6 months of investigation into a conspiracy that goes deeper than I initially realized. How deep? Ginny asked, already connecting the drive to an isolated laptop that had been modified with enough security features to make it functionally invisible to most tracking systems. Deep enough to include people with top-secret clearances, congressional staff members, and at least 3 different foreign intelligence services, Sarah replied. Deep enough that trying to report it through official channels got 6 people killed and put me on a termination list. Ginny's fingers paused over her keyboard. Termination as an employment termination, or the other kind, Marcus said grimly. Sarah's been running from professional assassins for 6 months. The motorcycle accident that brought her to my ER was actually an assassination attempt. Fuck, Ginny breathed, then immediately refocused on her screen. Okay, this just got a lot more interesting. And a lot more dangerous. You realize that by bringing this to me, you've probably put me on the same list. We realize, Sarah said quietly. That's why we're going to make sure we expose this thing before they have a chance to clean house again. Ginny began pulling up files, her expression growing more serious as she scanned the contents. Marcus watched her face change as she absorbed the scope of what Sarah had uncovered. The systematic theft of advanced encryption technology, the web of financial connections linking American defense contractors to foreign governments, the carefully orchestrated assassination campaign designed to silence witnesses. Jesus Christ, Ginny muttered, pulling up a series of financial documents that showed money flowing from shell companies in 3 different countries to Swiss bank accounts controlled by people with access to classified military research. How did you even get this information? 6 months of very careful surveillance, document photography, and signal interception, Sarah replied, plus some old-fashioned breaking and entering when electronic methods weren't sufficient. These communication intercepts, you recorded actual phone conversations between the conspirators, audio, and transcripts, including several conversations that explicitly discuss selling quantum encryption technology to Chinese and Russian intelligence services. Sarah leaned forward, pointing to a specific file. That conversation there is between Congressman Michael Richardson and a man identified as Colonel Chin Wei, military attaché to the Chinese embassy in Washington. Ginny opened the audio file, and the clear voices of 2 men discussing the transfer of classified technology filled the apartment. Marcus felt his blood run cold as he listened to an elected American official casually discussing the sale of military secrets to a foreign power, talking about it as if it were nothing more than a business transaction. This is... Ginny stopped, unable to find words. This is treason, not just regular corruption or influence peddling. This is actual, no-shit treason. It gets worse, Sarah said, pulling up another series of documents. The technology they're stealing isn't just valuable for its encryption capabilities. It's also being used as the foundation for a next-generation military communication system that would give any foreign power real-time access to American tactical communications. Marcus studied the technical specifications, trying to understand the implications. Are you saying they could intercept military communications in real time? I'm saying they could do more than intercept them, Sarah replied grimly. With this technology, they could insert false information directly into military communication systems. Fake orders, altered intelligence, compromised strategic planning. It would be like giving an enemy direct access to American military command and control systems. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. American soldiers would die because of this technology theft. Missions would fail. Strategic advantages would be handed directly to enemies who wouldn't hesitate to use them. It was the kind of betrayal that made his hands shake with barely controlled rage. Ginny had gone pale as she continued reading through the files. The kill list, she said suddenly. There's a document here labeled Asset Protection Protocol. It's a list of names with dates and methods. Sarah nodded grimly. Everyone who knew about the technology transfer or had access to evidence. I'm number 7 on that list, scheduled for vehicular accident 6 days ago. Number 7? Marcus felt his blood run cold. What happened to 1 through 6? Dr. Chun Liu, heart attack induced by untraceable poison. Dr. Maria Santos, car accident caused by remotely hacked vehicle systems. James Morrison, apparent suicide by gunshot. Lisa Wong, allergic reaction to food that had been tampered with. David Kim, drowning during a boating accident in calm weather. Robert Jackson, fatal heart attack during routine surgery, medical equipment sabotage. Jenny was staring at the screen, her face white. They killed 6 people. 6 innocent people who were just doing their jobs. And they would have killed me too if I hadn't gotten lucky, Sarah said. The question now is what we do with this information. Marcus had been thinking about that question for the past 3 days, weighing their options against the resources and reach of their enemies. Traditional law enforcement was compromised. The conspiracy included people with access to federal databases and communication systems. Foreign allies might be reluctant to act on intelligence that implicated their own agents. Congressional oversight was impossible when members of Congress were part of the conspiracy. We need multiple channels, he said finally. Simultaneous exposure through so many different sources that they can't suppress all of them. Jenny nodded, her technical mind already working through the logistics. I can set up anonymous releases to every major news organization simultaneously. WikiLeaks-style document dumps that would be impossible to trace back to us. That covers the media exposure, Sarah agreed. But we also need law enforcement action. These people need to be arrested and prosecuted, not just embarrassed in the newspapers. I might have an idea about that, Marcus said. There's someone I served with in Afghanistan who's now working for the FBI. Clean record, solid integrity, completely outside the intelligence community power structure that's been compromised. Can you trust him? Sarah asked. Marcus thought about Tom Bradley, the former Marine who'd saved his life during a firefight outside Kabul and had gone on to become one of the FBI's most effective counterintelligence agents. Tom was the kind of person who joined law enforcement to serve justice rather than advance his career, the kind of agent who would pursue a case like this regardless of the political consequences. With my life, Marcus said. More importantly, I can trust him to hate traitors more than he values his career advancement. Okay, Jenny said, pulling up a new screen and beginning to type rapidly. Here's what I'm thinking. We create a coordinated exposure campaign. First wave hits the news media. Every major newspaper and television network gets the complete document package simultaneously, along with analysis that makes the implications impossible to ignore. Second wave? Sarah asked. Law enforcement. We get clean copies of everything to your FBI contact, along with enough supporting evidence to make arrests inevitable. But we also send copies to oversight agencies, congressional committees, and international allies who have been damaged by this conspiracy. Marcus nodded, feeling the familiar rush of a complex operation coming together. Timing, 48 hours from now, Jenny said. That gives me time to set up truly anonymous release mechanisms that can't be traced back to us, and give you time to contact your FBI friend and set up the law enforcement handoff. What about us? Sarah asked. Once this goes public, we become primary targets for anyone trying to clean up loose ends. Marcus had been thinking about that problem as well. We disappear. New identities, new locations, complete break from our current lives until the arrests are made, and the conspiracy is broken. I can help with that, Jenny said. Digital identity creation is one of my specialties. Give me 72 hours, and I can make you into completely different people with bulletproof documentation. Sarah was quiet for a moment, staring at the evidence of betrayal spread across Jenny's laptop screen. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd made peace with a dangerous decision. There's something else, she said. Something I haven't told you yet because I wasn't sure we'd get this far. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. What? The technology they're stealing. It's not just valuable for its encryption capabilities. It's also the key to something called Project Blackout, a Department of Defense program designed to create unbreakable communication networks for military operations. Sarah met his eyes. I think they're planning to use it for a major terrorist attack on American soil. Jenny's fingers froze over her keyboard. What kind of attack? The kind that requires perfect coordination between multiple cells, the kind that would be impossible to execute without secure, undetectable communications. Sarah pulled up another file, this one containing fragments of intercepted conversations and coded messages. I've been tracking references to something called the 4th of July package for the past month. Target date is obvious, but the specifics. Marcus felt his blood run cold as he read through the fragmentary intelligence Sarah had gathered. References to maximum psychological impact, coordinated strikes, and media amplification painted a picture of something far more sophisticated than a traditional terrorist attack. They're not just selling military secrets, he breathed. They're planning to use those secrets to orchestrate a terrorist attack that would justify massive retaliation against foreign powers. A false flag operation, Sarah confirmed. Make it look like foreign terrorists used stolen American technology to attack American targets. The resulting war would justify massive defense spending, create opportunities for the conspirators to profit from both sides, and distract from their other criminal activities. Jenny leaned back in her chair, overwhelmed by the scope of what they'd uncovered. We're not just talking about espionage anymore. We're talking about conspiracy to commit mass murder and start a war. Which means we're not just fighting for justice, Marcus said grimly. We're fighting to prevent a catastrophe that could kill thousands of innocent people. The weight of that responsibility settled over the apartment like a heavy blanket. 3 people with limited resources, facing enemies with virtually unlimited reach, and the willingness to kill anyone who stood in their way. The odds were overwhelming, the danger personal and immediate. But as Marcus looked at Sarah and Jenny, seeing the same determination in their eyes that he felt in his own chest, he knew they would fight anyway. Some battles were too important to avoid, regardless of the personal cost. 48 hours, he said finally. We have 48 hours to expose this conspiracy and prevent a terrorist attack that could change the course of history. Then, we better get to work, Sarah said, her voice carrying the calm focus that Marcus remembered from their military days. As the 3 of them settled in for what would undoubtedly be the most dangerous 2 days of their lives, Marcus couldn't help but think about the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. A chance encounter in an emergency room, a recognition that transcended years and circumstances, and now a shared commitment to fight against impossible odds for a cause larger than any of their individual lives. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. And sometimes that was enough. The countdown had begun 46 hours ago, and now Marcus stood in the pre-dawn darkness of a Chicago warehouse district, watching Jenny complete the final preparations for what they'd codenamed Operation Daylight. Around them, an impressive array of electronic equipment hummed quietly, preparing to simultaneously transmit terabytes of classified evidence to news organizations, law enforcement agencies, and oversight committees across 3 continents. Sarah moved through the shadows near the warehouse entrance, her injuries now barely visible as she conducted a final perimeter check. They'd chosen this location carefully, an abandoned electronics factory with reinforced walls that would block most surveillance equipment, multiple exit routes, and no digital footprint that could be traced back to any of them. Jenny had spent 2 days modifying the building's electrical system to support their equipment while maintaining complete electronic silence until the moment of transmission. T-minus 30 minutes, Jenny announced from her position at the control station. All systems green, transmission protocols verified, recipient list confirmed. Once we start this, there's no stopping it. Marcus checked his secure phone, confirming that Tom Bradley was in position at FBI headquarters with a team of clean agents ready to begin immediate arrests based on the evidence they were about to provide. It had taken careful maneuvering to reach Tom without alerting the corrupted elements within federal law enforcement. But old military bonds and shared trust had made it possible. Sarah, he called softly. Status. Perimeter clear, she replied, slipping back into the warehouse. But we got company inbound. 3 vehicles, government plates, moving this way from the north. ETA approximately 10 minutes. Marcus felt his blood run cold. How'd they find us? Does it matter? Sarah asked, already moving toward their emergency equipment cache. They're here, which means we execute now, or we don't execute at all. Jenny's fingers were flying over her keyboards, accelerating timelines, and bypassing safety protocols they'd planned to use. I can have everything transmitted in 7 minutes if we skip the verification checks and just fire everything simultaneously. Do it, Marcus said without hesitation. The evidence was solid, the recipients verified. Whatever happened to them personally was less important than ensuring the conspiracy was exposed before they could be silenced. But as he moved to help Sarah prepare their defensive positions, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that their discovery wasn't accidental. They'd been too careful, taken too many precautions for this to be simple bad luck or superior surveillance. Jenny, he said suddenly, when you accessed Sarah's files 3 days ago, did you notice anything unusual about the data structure? Any signs that someone else had been inside the encrypted storage? Jenny paused in her transmission preparations, her expression shifting to one of professional concern. Now that you mention it, there were some anomalous timestamps on several files. I assumed it was just encryption artifacts, but it could have been evidence of intrusion, Sarah finished grimly. Someone's been monitoring my files, waiting to see who I would contact and where we would make our move. The implications hit all 3 of them simultaneously. This hadn't been a leak in their operational security. It had been a trap designed to draw them into the open where they could be eliminated along with the evidence they'd gathered. How long until transmission is complete? Marcus asked, automatically checking his sidearm and the spare magazine Sarah had procured for him. For minutes, Jenny replied, her voice tight with concentration. Maybe 3 if I bypass the final security checks. Outside, the sound of vehicle doors slamming echoed through the empty industrial district. Marcus estimated at least 12 people based on the audio signatures, probably more. Professional operators moving with the kind of coordination that suggested extensive training and planning. They're not coming to arrest us, Sarah said quietly, reading the tactical situation with the experience of someone who'd been hunted for months. This is a cleanup operation. They're here to kill us and destroy the evidence. Marcus felt the familiar calm that had always settled over him in combat situations. Fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by the clarity that came from having a clear mission and limited options for achieving it. Positions, he said, falling back on military command protocols. Jenny, you keep working on the transmission. Sarah, and I will buy you time. 3 minutes, Jenny said, her concentration absolute despite the approaching danger. I need 3 more minutes. The first shots came through the warehouse's front entrance, automatic weapons fire that shredded the metal doors and sent sparks flying from the electrical conduits. Sarah responded immediately, her return fire precise and devastating. 2 of the attackers dropped before the rest found cover behind concrete pillars and abandoned machinery. Marcus positioned himself to cover the side entrance, knowing their enemies would try to flank them. When the first black-clad figure appeared, he was ready. His shot took the man's center mass, sending him crashing back through the doorway with a cry that warned his teammates about the organized resistance they faced. Professional military contractors, Sarah called out during a brief lull in the firefight. Gear is too high-end for regular intelligence operatives. Someone paid serious money for this operation. More gunfire erupted from multiple directions as their attackers coordinated their assault. Marcus counted at least 8 different weapon signatures, suggesting a team large enough to completely surround the building. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in a position that offered limited cover against a determined assault. But they had one advantage their enemies didn't expect. Jenny's transmission was still running, still uploading evidence that would destroy the conspiracy even if none of them survived to see it. 2 minutes, Jenny announced, her voice steady despite the bullets flying overhead. Transmission is 60% complete. A new sound joined the chaos, the distinctive rotor noise of an approaching helicopter. Marcus felt his heart sink as he realized their enemies had brought air support, making escape virtually impossible even if they managed to survive the ground assault. "Roof access," Sarah called out, pointing toward a maintenance ladder that led to the warehouse's upper level. "If they're bringing in air assets, we need to deny them the high ground advantage." Marcus nodded, understanding immediately. While one of them stayed to protect Jenny, the other would need to neutralize the helicopter threat before it could bring overwhelming firepower to bear on their position. "I'll take it," he said, but Sarah was already moving toward the ladder. "You're a better shot from distance," she replied, hauling herself upward despite the stress on her still-healing injuries. "Cover Jenny and keep the ground team off our backs." Before Marcus could argue, Sarah had disappeared through the roof access hatch. Seconds later, he heard the distinctive crack of her rifle from above, followed by the satisfying sound of the helicopter's engine beginning to sputter and fail. "1 minute," Jenny shouted over the increasing gunfire. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it for 1 more minute." Marcus emptied his magazine into the concrete pillar where 3 attackers had taken cover, forcing them to retreat deeper into the warehouse. He reloaded smoothly, muscle memory from countless training exercises taking over as conscious thought focused on tactical calculations. The helicopter crashed somewhere outside the building, its destruction eliminating the air threat, but also likely calling in reinforcements. They were living on borrowed time now, each second bringing them closer to completion of their mission and closer to overwhelming enemy response. Sarah's voice crackled over their improvised radio system. "Ground vehicles approaching from the south. Looks like backup arriving. We've got maybe 2 minutes before we're completely surrounded." 30 seconds, Jenny called out. "Transmission is 95% complete." The final push came from all directions simultaneously, a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm their defenses through sheer volume of fire. Marcus found himself engaged with multiple targets, his training and Sarah's covering fire from the roof, the only things keeping him alive as bullets shredded the air around his position. But it was enough. Just barely, impossibly it was enough. "Transmission complete," Jenny announced triumphantly. Evidence package delivered to 47 different recipients across 6 countries. The story's out there now, no way to suppress it. The sense of completion was immediately overshadowed by the reality of their tactical situation. They'd accomplished their mission, but they were still trapped in a warehouse with hostile forces closing in from all directions. "Exit strategy?" Sarah's voice came from above, clinical despite the chaos surrounding them. Marcus looked around the warehouse, evaluating their options. The main entrance was blocked by hostile forces. The side exits were similarly compromised. Their only realistic option was basement, he said suddenly. "Jenny, is there basement access in this building?" "Should be," she replied, already packing her essential equipment. Most of these old factories were built with underground storage areas. They found the basement access behind a pile of abandoned machinery, a heavy metal door that opened onto concrete steps leading into darkness. It wasn't ideal. Basements were potential death traps if the exit routes were compromised, but it was better than trying to fight their way through a dozen professional killers. The basement turned out to be a maze of storage rooms and maintenance tunnels that connected to several adjacent buildings. More importantly, it included access to the old city storm drain system that had been built to handle industrial runoff from the manufacturing district. "Storm drains connect to the river," Sarah observed, studying the layout with her tactical flashlight. "From there, we can reach safe extraction points downtown." The journey through the tunnels was nightmare fuel. Narrow concrete passages filled with decades of industrial waste, knee-deep water that smelled of chemicals and decay, and the constant fear that their enemies might discover their escape route. But it was also salvation, carrying them away from the immediate threat and toward the safety of the urban maze where they could disappear among 8 million innocent civilians. They emerged from a drainage outlet 6 miles from the warehouse, dirty and exhausted but alive. Ginny's equipment had survived the journey, protected by waterproof cases that contained the backup copies of all their evidence. More importantly, her secure communication device confirmed that news organizations worldwide were already beginning to report on the massive intelligence leak they'd orchestrated. 3 hours later, they sat in a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of Chicago, watching news coverage of what the media was already calling the largest espionage scandal in American history. Congressman Richardson had been arrested by FBI agents as he tried to board a private jet to Switzerland. Colonel Chin Wei was in federal custody, along with 11 other co-conspirators whose names appeared on Sarah's evidence list. "Think it's over?" Ginny asked, staring at the television screen where a news anchor was describing the scope of the conspiracy they'd exposed. "The immediate threat, yes," Sarah replied. "The assassination teams will be recalled, the cover-up operations suspended. Too much attention now for them to risk further violence." "What about the terrorist attack?" Marcus asked. "The 4th of July operation you uncovered." Sarah smiled for the first time since their ordeal began. Richardson was the key coordinator for that plan. With him in custody and the communication networks compromised, there's no way they can execute a coordinated strike. "The FBI will have enough intelligence from our evidence dump to roll up the entire network." Marcus leaned back in his booth, feeling the exhaustion of the past week settling into his bones. They'd done it, exposed the conspiracy, prevented a terrorist attack, and survived long enough to see justice beginning to unfold. It should have felt triumphant, but instead he found himself thinking about the cost. His career as an emergency room doctor was over. No way to return to that life after what had happened. Sarah would need to disappear entirely, assume a new identity, and build a new life from scratch. Ginny would face investigation by multiple federal agencies, her past assistance to law enforcement offering some protection, but no guarantees. "So what now?" he asked, voicing the question they were all thinking. "Now we become different people," Sarah said quietly. "New names, new histories, new lives built on the assumption that we died in that warehouse. It's the only way to be truly safe from the remaining elements of the conspiracy." Ginny nodded, already working on her laptop to finalize their new identity documents. "I can have everything ready by tomorrow morning. Clean papers, financial histories, the works. You'll be able to start over anywhere you want." Marcus considered the offer, thinking about the life he'd be leaving behind. It wasn't much, a job he'd performed competently, but without passion, an apartment he'd never really made into a home, relationships that had remained superficial because he'd never been willing to trust anyone with the truth about his past. "What if I don't want to start over alone?" he asked, meeting Sarah's eyes across the table. She studied his face for a long moment, searching for something. "Marcus, you know what my life has been like. The running, the violence, the inability to trust anyone or build anything permanent. That's not going to change just because we exposed this conspiracy. Maybe it's time for both of us to try something different," he replied. "Maybe it's time to build something together instead of just surviving apart." The offer hung in the air between them, carrying weight that went far beyond the immediate logistics of their situation. They found each other twice now, once in the chaos of a battlefield, once in the sterile environment of an emergency room. Both times, they'd recognized something in each other that transcended their individual circumstances. "Where would we go?" Sarah asked, and Marcus heard the beginning of acceptance in her voice. "Somewhere quiet," he said. "Somewhere we can use our skills to help people instead of fight them. Rural medicine, disaster relief, something that matters but doesn't require us to carry weapons every day." Ginny looked up from her laptop, smiling at something she saw in their faces. "I can arrange for you to be married," she said. "Part of your cover identity. Husband and wife, former military medics who retired to pursue humanitarian work. It would actually strengthen your documentation if you had shared history." Marcus felt his heart speed up as he realized they were actually discussing a future together, a possibility he hadn't dared to consider when Sarah first appeared in his emergency room a week ago. "What do you think?" he asked her directly. Sarah was quiet for a moment, then reached across the table and took his hand. "I think," she said slowly, "that I'm tired of being alone. And I think you're the only person I've ever met who might understand what that means. It wasn't a declaration of love in any traditional sense, but it was something deeper, a recognition of shared experiences and compatible wounds, an acknowledgement that they'd both been looking for someone who could understand the weight they carried. Okay, then, Marcus said, feeling a smile spread across his face for the first time in days. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, humanitarian medical workers, relocating to where? Montana, Jenny suggested, pulling up maps on her screen. Remote enough for privacy, isolated enough that newcomers don't attract much attention, but with enough medical infrastructure that your skills would be valued. 3 months later, Dr. Michael Thompson and Dr. Sarah Thompson stood on the porch of their small clinic in a town so small it barely rated a spot on most maps. They'd been treating everything from broken bones to complicated births, earning the trust and respect of a community that asked few questions about their past and judged them only on their willingness to help. The conspiracy trials were still making news, but they watched from a distance now, their testimony provided through sealed depositions that protected their new identities. Richardson and his co-conspirators would spend the rest of their lives in federal prison. The terrorist attack had been prevented, the stolen technology recovered, the foreign intelligence networks disrupted. But more importantly, Marcus and Sarah had found something neither of them had expected when they'd started this fight. The possibility of building a life based on healing rather than survival, on trust rather than paranoia, on shared hope rather than shared trauma. They still carried weapons out of ingrained habit, still checked sight lines and exit routes wherever they went. Some habits were too deeply embedded to ever fully disappear. But they were building something new together, something that acknowledged their past while refusing to be defined by it. Any regrets? Sarah asked, watching the sun set over the mountains that surrounded their new home. Marcus considered the question, thinking about the life he'd left behind, the career he'd sacrificed, the risks they'd taken for a cause larger than themselves. None, he said finally, meaning it completely. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And after everything they'd been through, that felt like the most powerful victory of all.